Okay, let's fix this thing. Now, before I get into this, we have to do a disclaimer. I'm not a professional welder. I don't even pretend to play one on YouTube, but I'm a mechanic that's been welding stuff for the last 45 years. So something like this is, I've done this 100 times, countless times, and the success rate is way over 90%. So I have no doubt that this is going to work. It's a very simple repair. We're going to stick a broken ear back onto a casting, which is a lot different than welding a casting that has a crack someplace through the middle of it. But that said, in the comments, I'm sure of this, I'm certain of this, there are going to be countless professional welders who are going to jump in and say, oh, do it this way, do it that way, use this rod, this technique, blah, 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 blah. Listen to them. They do know what they're talking about. And then based on what I'm going to show you here and what they say, make your own judgment call. This isn't something I would recommend on a rare, exotic, impossible to replace casting. In that case, I would suggest bringing it to somebody who knows what they're doing and is going to do a professional job. I'm just going to fix it so it works. All right, so here's the mission. We have this ear broken off this exhaust manifold. Now, we talked about this in a previous video. The cylinder head that this manifold was bolted to is a later model head than it was intended to be used with, and it has a boss at the bottom of the head. As a jig to hold this casting together while I weld it, I'm using a later head, just like the one that's on the car that broke this manifold. So here you can see the boss that they added in the 70s to these cylinder heads. This is a mid-1980s 360 casting. But this boss here is identical to the one that's on the engine in the car. And if we take this manifold, hard to do this one hand and film at the same time. We take this manifold, we can see our point of interference. So we're going to have to grind this down, not only on this jig head, but on the head that's on the car currently. So, but by doing it this way, by using this head, we know exactly how much and where we have to take the metal off of the one that's in the car. So at any rate, that's what happened. They took this manifold from a 1960s engine, tried to bolt on it to a 1970s head, found this point of interference, or didn't find it, I should say, and just tightened it down and broke this ear off. So, first step with this, I think we're going to grind on the head to create the clearance that we need so we can bolt the manifold to it as a jig. So I'll do that and then come back. You don't need to see me actually grinding on a cylinder head, right? I'll show you what I end up with. So that actually took a good bit more grinding than I was expecting. Because when I first laid the manifold on it, it looked like it was just the corner that needed to be taken down. But no, you know, the angles will fool you. So I ended up having to mill off pretty much the whole boss to get the manifold to sit flush against it. So that's how much I ended up having to take off. So by comparison, that's what was needed to get the manifold to sit against the head. Now, I'm glad I did it this way, because if I was working under the hood in that tight corner where I can't see the angle, well, I wouldn't have taken as much as I did off. So that could have been problems. So I'm glad we did it this way. But now the next step is we've got to dress out the manifold so that we can stick that ear back on it. So it's a very straightforward crack. What's missing here so we're going to have to V this. We need to give the weld a place to sit in there. We don't want to just weld over the top. That's not going to fix it. We need to grind into the manifold, into the broken ear, and give ourselves like a valley for the weld to fill into. And we got to eliminate as much crack as possible, because even if this is welded, wherever a crack still exists, like let's say down here in the corner, it's a riser where a new crack can form and break around the weld that we're going to put in there. So I'm going to use this thing here and V it out as much as I think I can get away with. It's fairly thin in some areas and I don't want to go all the way through, but I want to get it to where it's just enough so that as I'm welding it, the weld will just fill that gap. So let's grind on it. Okay, we're getting closer to the fun part. So you can see here the gap that we created. Tried to keep it as even as possible, but now the manifold is bolted to the cylinder head and the broken part is broken to the cylinder head. So she's all secure, sitting flush. Now the only issue that we have is that this part of the stud right here is going to be in the way when we go to lay our bead in that gap. So we're going to have to grind that off, get it as flush as possible. So I'll just go ahead and do that and then we'll spark it up. There we go, we can get in there now. So for this exercise in backyard hackery, we will be using our handy dandy $109 Harbor Freight Flux core welder. I know, go ahead and laugh at it. Laugh all you want. We've built entire cars out of that thing on this channel and they've held together just fine. So now we're going to weld this manifold together with it. Settings, high and low. Put it on high. Wire feed, going to set it at 3. And we're using a 35 thousandths flux core wire with this. So let's see what happens. Woo-wee! So we're going to try to lay our bead in there in one shot to avoid as much heating as possible, because the hotter the overall casting gets, the more distortions there are going to be. And having it bolted to a jig, well, not only having it bolted to a jig, absolutely essential to keeping it flat, but the jig will also act kind of like as a heat sink and pull some of the heat away. So we're going to try to do this in one shot. Then we're going to let it cool and then make another lap over it. So Okay, so that's our first pass with it. The casting is still, I mean, it's over here it's still ice cold. Here it's a little warm. Here it's definitely going to be hot. We screwed up a little bit and I welded to the nut, but I'm not too worried about that. We'll cut that free somehow. So let's let this thing sit for a good, I don't know, 15-20 minutes, and then we'll give it another pass. But so far it's looking pretty good. Alright, so it's cooled off, and we just cleaned it up with a wire brush. Get all the slag off of there. Now, this part probably isn't necessary, and it's going to take what looks like a pretty nice looking weld, more or less, for a flux core welder on cast iron. That doesn't look too bad. This is going to take a pretty decent looking weld and kind of make it look gloppy and ugly. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to trace along the upper part of the bead, because that's the thinnest part of the manifold, and if this thing is going to break anywhere, that's where it's going to break. So I'm going to attach the bead that I just laid to the upper part over here, because like I said, this is very thin. So if it's going to break, if it's going to crack, it's going to do it right there. So I'm just going to come along the top over here and fill it in a little bit more, just to bridge it. Let's see if we can't make it try to look halfway pretty. That looks good. That looks good. And you know what? I think at this point we're going to call it fixed. So I'm going to let this cool for like 15 to 20 minutes and pull it off and see what we have. Yeah, I had to cut the nut off. It was welded in there a little too good. Alright, no biggie. Okay, so that's what the other side looks like. And I have a little bit of a gap there. Not a gap to the outside, but just a gap between the manifold and the eater we just welded back on. So I'm going to just lay a quick bead in that to fill that. Lay a straight edge over it when I'm done, just to make sure that there isn't any warpage. And I think we're good to go. I'm happy with that. That I know is going to hold. So the next step, just clean it up, grind on the cylinder head, that boss that we're going to have to, bring down for clearance, and then she's good to go. So once again with that disclaimer, I am not a professional welder. I don't even play one on YouTube. Do what I'm doing here at your own risk, right? But it's worth a shot. Like I said, I've done this countless times on countless different castings over the years. Repairing a broken off ear is a lot different than repairing a crack that goes through the casting where there's all kinds of stresses. So keep that in mind. It's worth a shot. Worst comes to worst, it breaks off, and then you go and you bring it to a real welder and let him do it the right way. All right, so I hope you got something out of that. I'll see you tomorrow.